Look at this landscape. During the Middle Ages, this scorched, salt-domed island had no agricultural land, no natural resources, and no fresh water. Yet for centuries, the city built upon these barren rocks, Jarun, operated as one of the wealthiest and most powerful trading metropolises in the world. Jarun sat directly inside the Strait of Hormuz. Every ship passing between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean had to navigate this narrow 21 nautical mile channel. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we begin our series on the strategic history of the Strait of Hormuz. If you find this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. The success of this isolated rock demonstrates a core geopolitical reality. Power is often dictated more by the geographical choke points a nation controls than by what its land can actually produce. For centuries, merchants attempted to move wealth across the land. The overland Silk Road required caravans to traverse thousands of miles of hostile terrain. These routes were plagued by logistical failures. Caravans faced treacherous mountain passes, extreme desert climates, and shifting political borders that brought constant warfare and heavy taxation. To transport heavy commodities like ceramics, precious metals, and massive quantities of spices, empires turned to the Maritime Silk Road. The ocean offered a highway capable of moving bulk goods at a volume land routes could never match. To dominate the wealth of Eurasia, an empire had to control the maritime gateway connecting the eastern and western oceans. The military strategists of antiquity recognized this maritime gateway long before the Middle Ages. In the era of Alexander the Great, naval commanders began charting these coastal waters to secure ocean routes. This map traces the expedition of Nearchus. In 325 BCE, he navigated a fleet from the Indus Delta through the Strait of Hormuz, proving that a direct sea link existed between India and the Near East. His voyage provided concrete evidence that maritime commerce was highly efficient and scalable, bypassing the instability of the desert paths. By 150 CE, Claudius Ptolemy had documented the importance of this passage in his Geographia. Ptolemy identified this specific passage as the essential hinge connecting the Indian Ocean, then called the Erythraean Sea, with the interior river systems of Mesopotamia. Ancient mapmakers viewed the strait not as a border to be crossed, but as the primary conduit linking the commerce of the East and West. By the Middle Ages, local rulers leveraged this geography to establish the Kingdom of Hormuz as an unparalleled economic power. Originally based on the mainland, the kingdom made a strategic decision to relocate its capital to the barren island of Jarun. The rocky environment acted as a natural fortress against mainland sieges. This defensibility came with a massive logistical cost. Because the island produced nothing, every single necessity, including daily supplies of fresh water, had to be ferried in by boat from the mainland. The city funded these imports through the trade of high-margin luxuries, Arabian war horses, bulk spices, and these world-renowned regional pearls. The combination of extreme geographic isolation and a total monopoly over the maritime choke point created an economic system where trade profits alone sustained an entire population in a wasteland. Foreign explorers witnessed the sheer scale of this trade. In the late 13th century, the Venetian merchant Marco Polo traveled through Hormuz twice. He described a harbor crowded with vessels arriving from India, loaded with silk, gold, precious stones, and spices that were then distributed across the world. Decades later, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited the island. He recorded his observations of Hormuz as a sprawling metropolis where the wealth of various continents converged. As this diagram shows, the output of India and the specialized markets of Arabia and Persia all met at this single point. The island served as the mandatory clearinghouse for regional wealth. By the late Middle Ages, the Kingdom of Hormuz had utilized its position to become the premier global trade nexus of the known world. The history of Hormuz illustrates how the control of a single transit point can generate more wealth than the possession of vast natural resources. This map illustrates the convergence. Controlling those 21 miles of water meant holding the undisputed maritime gateway to Eurasian commerce. However, this monopoly was about to face a violent disruption. The development of deep-water imperial navies would soon challenge the local control of the strait. In Part 2, we will examine these conflicts, beginning with Afonso de Albuquerque's Portuguese naval invasion and the 1622 alliance that eventually changed the region's trajectory. We will trace how this medieval spice corridor evolved over the centuries, eventually transforming into the most critical energy transit bottleneck in the modern world. Looking at this map of the Middle East, right at the narrowest entry to the Persian Gulf, you can see a tiny waterway compressing a massive volume of global energy. That is the Strait of Hormuz, and every single day, roughly 20% of the world's petroleum liquids flow directly through it. It is the absolute definition of a maritime choke point. Because all of that fuel is squeezed into a lane just 2 miles wide in places, a localized disruption here instantly causes global energy markets to panic, freezing international supply chains. But this structural vulnerability is not a modern invention. Rewind to the 16th century, and you'll find the exact same geographic trap. Instead of crude oil and natural gas, the cargo was silk, pearls, and massive volumes of spices. Empires rise and fall, but the physical shape of the continents remains locked in place. Because the map never changes, this specific stretch of water has always been a primary target for anyone trying to hold international trade hostage. In the early 1500s, a Portuguese naval strategist named Afonso de Albuquerque saw exactly how to exploit that geography. He realized Portugal could dominate the Indian Ocean without maintaining a massive, expensive land army. As this map of the Indian Ocean shows, Albuquerque formulated a highly efficient master plan. All the major sea routes into Asia funnel through 3 narrow bottlenecks. By conquering Malacca in the east, Aden at the Red Sea, and Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, a small fleet could dictate trade for an entire hemisphere. Albuquerque launched his assault on Hormuz in 1507. Following a rapid naval victory, the Portuguese built the Fort of Our Lady of the Conception. Today, you can still see the massive stone walls and coastal artillery they installed to physically threaten any ship moving through the strait. With their cannons pointed at the shipping lanes, the Portuguese enforced a strict system of maritime passports called cartazes. They systematically boarded and taxed every local merchant vessel attempting to enter or leave Asian waters. Portugal achieved superpower status not by conquering the vast interiors of Asia, but by seizing its primary routes of access and forcing the entire regional economy to pay them rent for over a century. To the north of this blockade lay the Safavid Empire of Persia. By the early 17th century, their ruler, Shah Abbas the Great, was tired of the Portuguese monopoly choking his merchants and decided it was time to reclaim Persia's sovereign waters. The Safavids faced an absolute strategic deficit. They commanded a massive, highly disciplined elite land army, but they completely lacked ocean-going warships. The Fort of Our Lady of the Conception sat isolated on an island in the strait. You cannot march infantry across deep water, and you cannot besiege a coastal fortress without cutting off its resupply lines. Recognizing the limits of his own military, Shah Abbas engineered a pragmatic solution. He approached the British East India Company and proposed a joint corporate military venture. The terms were highly complimentary. The British eagerly wanted trade access to the lucrative Persian mainland, and Shah Abbas required a leased fleet of heavily armed ships to evict the Portuguese. Shah Abbas set his national pride aside for tactical execution. He recognized that the only way to bridge a fatal capability gap in his military was to forge an alliance with a foreign power. This 17th-century illustrated map captures the culmination of that alliance, the 1622 synchronized amphibious assault to retake the island of Hormuz. The strategy relied on 2 coordinated prongs. First was the anvil. Under the command of General Imam Kuli Khan, Safavid troops crossed the shallow coastal waters on small transport craft. Once ashore, they dug in and laid a brutal landward siege against the Portuguese fortifications. Then came the hammer. Out in the deep water, the British fleet dropped anchor. They deployed their heavy broadside artillery to pulverize the Portuguese galleons and enforce an impenetrable naval blockade. Caught between the relentless Persian Sunsteins and the heavy British cannons, the supposedly invincible Portuguese garrison eventually collapsed, permanently breaking their century-long monopoly over the Asian gates. The 1622 operation proved that even an entrenched naval power can be overcome when adversaries isolate their strongholds and combine their specialized forces.
Immediately following the island's liberation, the victorious Safavids shifted their primary maritime operations away from the vulnerable offshore fortress and onto the mainland, establishing the booming trade port of Bandar Abbas. However, the Persian victory carried an unintended consequence. By proving the sheer destructive utility of their warships, the British East India Company secured a permanent, highly lucrative foothold in the Indian Ocean. With the Portuguese removed, a massive power vacuum opened up along the sea routes. Over the following decades, British commercial and military influence steadily expanded, eventually hardening into absolute imperial control. The irony of the Safavid alliance is stark. Dislodging one foreign monopoly over their waters ultimately just cleared the board for a new, even more powerful empire to take its place. Look at this massive tanker traversing the waters today. We fast-forwarded 400 years, and the cargo moving through the strait has evolved from wooden crates of spices to millions of tons of crude oil and liquefied natural gas. We have traded wooden sails and bronze cannons for massive steel hulls and satellite navigation, yet the geographic dominance of this narrow waterway is operating exactly as Afonso de Albuquerque calculated in 1507. Modern energy cartographers, supply chain analysts, and naval commanders monitor the Strait of Hormuz through the exact same anxious lens as those 16th-century mapmakers. Vessels change from wood to steel, and empires eventually collapse, but geography remains supreme. Whoever controls the passage through Hormuz controls the economic heartbeat of Asia.